October 1914, under a storm of shellfire at Ypres, a 23-year-old prince, grandson of Queen Victoria, collapsed in the mud. He was Prince Maurice of Battenberg, one of the few European royals who truly fought on the front line. Why did a man born in palaces die like an anonymous soldier, his body shattered under the roar of artillery? Maurice of Battenberg entered the world on October 3, 1891, at Balmoral Castle in the Scottish Highlands. His birth was celebrated in 2 languages, beneath 2 flags. His father, Prince Henry of Battenberg, carried the weight of German lineage, descended from the minor principalities of Hesse. His mother, Princess Beatrice, was the youngest daughter of Queen Victoria. The monarch who had once ruled over an empire so vast, it was said the sun never set upon it. Maurice was not merely a child. He was the symbolic knot tying together 2 dynasties that, within his short lifetime, would be pulled apart by blood and steel. From the beginning, his life carried a paradox. He was raised on British soil, yet surrounded by German echoes. His surname, Battenberg, literally meant mountain castle, and it bore the weight of the continent's tangled aristocracies. To the public eye, Maurice was the portrait of unity, a reminder that royal marriages could build bridges across rival nations. But beneath the polished veneer of diplomacy lay fragile foundations. Europe was shifting like tectonic plates, and the child who played in Balmoral's gardens would one day be caught in the earthquake. Maurice's earliest years unfolded in a household defined by both grandeur and absence. His mother, Beatrice, often called the Queen's Shadow, had devoted her life to caring for the aging Victoria. The boy grew up beneath the gaze of his grandmother, that stern matriarch whose face adorned coins and postage stamps across continents. Yet even within those gilded walls, Maurice's childhood was already marked by foreboding. The duality of his heritage followed him like a shadow. At Windsor and Osborne, he was a British prince among cousins who would later sit on thrones across Europe. George V in Britain, Wilhelm II in Germany, Nicholas II in Russia. Together, they appeared as a fraternity of crowned heirs, smiling in group portraits, their uniforms decorated with medals that gleamed like borrowed stars. But history was already sketching a darker portrait. These same cousins would soon lead their nations into a war that consumed millions, including Maurice himself. To his tutors and attendants, he seemed a bright, lively boy with an earnest disposition. But behind the innocence of youth lay an invisible burden, the knowledge that his very existence was political. Every smile he gave at public ceremonies, every bow in church, every formal dinner, was part of a performance scripted by dynastic expectation. His life, though wrapped in velvet and ceremony, was not entirely his own. Maurice's story began not in the trenches of Flanders, but in the contradictions of his bloodline. He was both bridge and fracture. A prince of Britain, a son of Germany, destined to embody the hope of unity, yet fated to perish in the war that proved unity was an illusion. His birth was a promise Europe could not keep. In 1896, when Maurice was barely 5 years old, the world collapsed in a silence he could not yet name. His father, Prince Henry of Battenberg, had sailed to Africa with the British expedition to Ashanti. There, beneath a foreign sun, malaria seized him. News of his death traveled back across oceans and reached Balmoral like a cracked bell. The young prince, too young to grasp the meaning of death, suddenly found the figure of strength in his life erased. The absence of a father is not simply a missing chair at the dinner table. For Maurice, it was an empty horizon against which he grew. At family gatherings, He watched other children tug at their father's uniforms or laugh at their jokes, while his own memory was filled only with fragments. The timbre of a voice, the smell of leather gloves, the ghost of a hand that once lifted him high. Childhood is supposed to be built on presence, yet his was sculpted by loss. Beatrice, his widowed mother, became his anchor. She had already dedicated her life to Queen Victoria, acting as translator, secretary, and companion. Now she carried both duties, sovereign daughter and single parent. Her grief was folded into silence. Her resilience became the fabric of Maurice's upbringing. In the royal residences of Osborne and Windsor, he walked at her side, his small steps echoing against stone corridors that seemed too large for them both. Grandmother Victoria, stern and mourning her own endless losses, kept watch from her throne. To her, Maurice was not merely a grandson, but a symbol of continuity in an empire that always seemed one bereavement away from collapse. He played in gardens designed for monarchs, beneath statues of past kings and queens. Reminders that history devours as much as it preserves. In photographs, the boy's expression carries both innocence and distance, the look of someone already acquainted with fragility. The world around him did not pause. His cousins grew taller, their paths marked out toward crowns and courts. But Maurice's own childhood seemed shadowed, as though a hand had drawn a veil across it. Without a father, every story told at night became not just entertainment, but a substitute presence. Every parade of soldiers he watched from palace windows was not just spectacle, but a reminder of the man who had died in service far from home. Loss, when it comes early, becomes a lens through which everything else is seen. Maurice would never shake it off. The silence of his father's absence would echo later in the trenches, when he faced another battlefield where fathers, sons, and brothers vanished by the thousands. His early years taught him, with cruel precision, that life could be extinguished suddenly and without fairness. It was a childhood carved from marble, beautiful in setting, but cold to the touch. Education, for a prince, was never a private affair. Each classroom was a stage, each lesson a rehearsal for future duty. Maurice began his studies at Wellington College, a school founded to honor the Duke of Wellington, hero of Waterloo. Its halls were filled with the echoes of past victories, its walls lined with portraits of men who had carved their names into Britain's military history. There, Maurice learned not just Latin and mathematics, but the unspoken language of discipline, sacrifice, and command. At Sandhurst, the Royal Military Academy, his training hardened into ritual. Days began before sunrise, the mist still clinging to the parade grounds like unspoken doubt. Boots thudded in unison, rifles gleamed in the pale light, and young men were sculpted into officers with a precision that felt almost mechanical. Yet Maurice stood out not for his title, but for his earnestness. He drilled as if he had something to prove, as though the absence of his father's guiding hand demanded that he earn his place among men through sweat and steel. Unlike many of his royal cousins, who treated uniforms as ceremonial costumes, Maurice embraced the identity of soldier with solemn gravity. He did not merely wear the insignia. He carried it as if it were a burden he must justify. His choice of regiment was telling: the King's Royal Rifle Corps, an elite unit whose reputation was forged in colonial wars and tested in unforgiving terrains. The green of their jackets symbolized not pageantry, but practicality. Men trained to blend with landscapes, to march light and strike fast. It was a regiment where status mattered less than grit, where a prince could not hide behind velvet curtains. Maurice thrived in the camaraderie of the barracks. Among fellow cadets, Laughter mingled with exhaustion, and friendships were hammered out on long marches and sleepless nights. For once, he was not defined by lineage, but by endurance. Blisters, aching muscles, and the sting of rain on his face stripped away the distance of royalty. In mud and sweat, he became simply Maurice, another young man trying to master the art of command. Still, the weight of expectation followed him. Newspapers occasionally mentioned his progress, portraying him as a model prince who embraced duty without complaint. Every report was both a compliment and a chain, binding him to the path of service. He might have pursued politics or the quiet life of a scholar, but destiny, and perhaps his own will, steered him toward the march of boots, the crack of rifles, the unending call of war. By the time he graduated, Europe itself was teetering. The alliances of empires were like dominoes, balanced precariously, waiting for the slightest push. Maurice, polished by training and clad in the green of the rifle corps, stood ready. The boy who had once grown up in the shadows of loss now walked willingly into the furnace of conflict. His life, shaped by absence and duty, was steering him toward a destiny no crown could shield him from. The summer of 1914 began like a fever dream. Europe shimmered in the sunlight of an old order, its monarchs exchanging letters and smiles, its aristocrats drifting between balls and country estates. Then, a single shot in Sarajevo cracked the illusion. The bullet that felled Archduke Franz Ferdinand did not just kill a man, it detonated a continent. Alliances twisted like tripwires, and within weeks the world was marching toward catastrophe. For Maurice, now 22, the transformation was abrupt. The cadet who had drilled on orderly parade grounds now stood at the threshold of a war unlike any Europe had seen. Nations that once mingled as family at royal weddings became enemies overnight. His cousins, George V of Britain, Wilhelm II of Germany, Nicholas II of Russia, were suddenly commanders of armies pitted against one another. The family portraits of Windsor seemed to curl in the heat of betrayal, the smiles on their painted lips dissolving into silence. When war was declared in August, Maurice did not hesitate. While many royals sought safe postings or honorary titles, he took up arms with his regiment, the King's Royal Rifle Corps. He understood, perhaps better than most, the fragility of privilege. To stay behind palace walls while millions marched into the unknown would be to live a life insulated from reality. And he had already lost too much to believe in insulation. The journey to the front was its own kind of descent. Trains rattled eastward, filled with young men who sang songs to drown their fear. The air in those compartments reeked of tobacco, sweat, and the unspoken knowledge that not all would return. Maurice sat among them, not as a prince above his peers, but as a lieutenant among equals. His presence reminded them that even royalty was not immune to the call of war. France and Belgium became landscapes of ruin. Villages once dotted with church steeples now smoldered, their bells melted into twisted metal. Fields that had fed generations were churned into mud by artillery. The Western Front was not a battlefield in the old sense, where cavalry charged and flags waved. It was a machine, vast and grinding, designed to consume lives with mechanical precision. Maurice entered this inferno as part of the British Expeditionary Force, known as the Old Contemptibles. The name, given mockingly by Kaiser Wilhelm, became a badge of honor. These men, professionals rather than conscripts, faced the German juggernaut with stubborn resolve. They dug trenches where hedgerows once grew, their spades carving open wounds into the earth. To walk through a trench was to inhabit another world. Walls of clay pressed close, the air damp with rot, The ground a mosaic of puddles and footprints. Rats thrived, feasting on what war left behind. The smell of unwashed bodies mingled with the sharp tang of cordite. For Maurice, raised in palaces perfumed with incense and wax, the contrast was staggering. Yet he did not recoil. If anything, he seemed to accept that this was the crucible where his life must be tested. The nights at the front were worst. Shells thundered without pattern, sudden eruptions that split the sky like lightning from some merciless god. The darkness was alive with whispers, orders passed down, prayers muttered, the rasp of a man writing what might be his final letter. In those hours, Maurice was no longer heir to any grandeur. He was a soldier, keeping watch under stars that seemed indifferent, their cold light falling equally on kings and commoners. His comrades noticed his composure. Unlike other officers who carried themselves with aloofness, he moved among his men without ceremony. He shared their rations, biscuits that crumbled like chalk, tea that tasted of tin, and listened to their stories. They called him our prince, not in jest, but with a quiet respect. In a war where class divisions often deepened resentment, Maurice's willingness to share hardship made him rare. Yet even as he earned the trust of his men, the machinery of war grew heavier. The German artillery was relentless, pounding the British lines with shells that seemed to erase entire hours of existence. Each blast was like the collapse of a cathedral, shaking earth and soul alike. Soldiers began to measure time not in days, but in barrages, in the brief intervals of silence between storms of steel. For Maurice, the front was more than a duty. It was an inheritance. His father had died of fever on a colonial campaign. Now he faced death in Europe's industrial slaughterhouse. The symmetry was cruel. 2 generations, both undone by war, though of very different kinds. In the prince's quiet moments, one imagines he must have felt the shadow of his father close, as though history were preparing to repeat itself in a darker key. By autumn, the focus of the war shifted toward the Belgian town of Ypres. The land there, flat and exposed, became the stage for one of the most savage contests of the early war. Maurice and his regiment marched toward it, their boots sinking into mud, their breaths clouding in the chill air. Behind them lay England, family, and the promise of a future. Ahead, only the smoke of burning villages and the thunder of German guns. The world had cracked open, and Prince Maurice of Battenberg was walking directly into its abyss. October 1914. The land around Ypres had once been postcard Belgium. Low fields stitched with hedgerows, villages clustered around quiet steeples. Now it was unrecognizable, a vast, open wound carved into the earth. The town itself became a name that would be repeated in hushed tones for generations. Ypres, where Europe's young were fed into the furnace of industrial slaughter. Maurice's regiment entered this landscape with weary determination. The King's Royal Rifle Corps had already endured weeks of fighting, but Ypres was different. Here, the German advance pressed relentlessly, seeking a breakthrough that would drive a spear into the heart of France. The British and their French allies, outnumbered and outgunned, braced themselves as though holding back an ocean with their bare hands. The trenches dug around Ypres were not fortresses, but shallow graves that men temporarily inhabited. Mud seeped into boots and uniforms, turning every step into a weight. Rain fell without mercy, and the flat land refused to drain. Soldiers lived half-buried, their bodies smeared in clay, as if the earth itself were rehearsing to claim them. Maurice, though only 23, now carried the responsibility of command. His men looked to him for steadiness when the horizon itself seemed to dissolve in smoke. The artillery fire was unceasing, each shell a punctuation mark in a grim story written across the fields. At night, the sky glowed with flares, pale arcs of light revealing shattered trees and lifeless silhouettes frozen in grotesque stillness. The first days of the battle blurred into one another. Orders arrived, often contradictory, and units moved forward or fell back without clear purpose. The lines were fluid, fragile as a thread stretched to breaking. German shells pulverized entire sections of trench, leaving nothing but smoking craters filled with water and the remains of men who had stood there moments before. In such chaos, survival was no longer a strategy, but a lottery. Maurice did not withdraw into the relative safety of dugouts, as some officers did. He walked the lines, his boots sinking in the same mud as his men, his voice steady as he gave commands. To those around him, his presence was both reassurance and paradox. Here was a grandson of Queen Victoria, living and dying like any rifleman, his green uniform indistinguishable beneath the grime. The symbolism was not lost. Newspapers back home would later highlight his service. But in those days at Ypres, there were no headlines, no cameras. Only men crouched in trenches, waiting for the next barrage. A prince was simply another body in the mud, another heartbeat drowned out by the roar of cannon. The battle unfolded with a rhythm of destruction. German assaults swept across open fields, their ranks mowed down by machine gun fire, only for new waves to follow. British counterattacks stumbled forward, bayonets glinting briefly before vanishing into smoke. The land itself became the enemy. Craters that swallowed men whole, barbed wire snarled like iron thorns, the constant stench of decay that clung to everything. For Maurice, Ypres was not merely a posting, but a crucible. He wrote brief notes to his mother when he could, words that carried no hint of despair. Letters from officers in war often sound the same, stoic, restrained, as if language itself could not risk unraveling. What could he have said? That the world he grew up in, of chandeliers and state dinners, had no meaning here. That in Ypres, kings and farmhands were equal before the Shellfire. The men of his regiment endured with the fatalism of those who know they are expendable. They shared cigarettes, swapped stories, and carved initials into trench walls, as if to leave some proof of existence before the inevitable. Rain mixed with gunpowder and blood, turning the ground into a thick paste that glued memory and flesh together. There were moments when silence fell. Uncanny, deceptive. Birds might return briefly, their wings startlingly bright against the gray sky. In those instants, men could almost believe the nightmare had ended. But then the bombardment resumed, and the illusion shattered. The air trembled as if the very sky were collapsing. Maurice held his composure. Witnesses later recalled that he encouraged his men not with speeches but with simple gestures, a steady hand, a calm glance, the willingness to stand where the danger was greatest. In a war that reduced humanity to fragments, such small acts became monumental. As October deepened, the casualty lists grew longer. Entire companies were erased in hours. Reinforcements arrived thin and exhausted, scarcely able to hold rifles. Yet the line held, as though by sheer defiance. The First Battle of Ypres became not a victory, but a stand, a refusal to yield. Thousands were buried beneath the mud, and still the armies clawed at the same ruined ground. For Maurice, Ypres was the narrowing of fate. Each sunrise was a reprieve. Each nightfall, a reminder that time was running out. The young prince, who had once embodied unity between Britain and Germany, now found himself crushed between their hatred. He had entered the war as a symbol. At Ypres, he became a soldier in the fullest, bleakest sense. The fields of Flanders were no longer fields at all. They were a vast graveyard in the making, and Maurice of Battenberg was already walking among the tombstones. On the morning of October 27th, 1914, the sky above Ypres was colorless, a dome of ash that pressed down upon the men below. The first battle was reaching its peak, every trench stretched to breaking, every soldier strung taut like wire about to snap. Among them, Lieutenant Prince Maurice of Battenberg stood with his unit, boots sunk into mud that clung like chains. He was 23, and time itself was running thin. The day began as so many others had. Artillery fire rolling in waves, rifles cracking, officers shouting through the din. The ground shuddered with each bombardment, as if the land were alive and writhing. Smoke blurred the horizon until friend and foe dissolved into silhouettes. Orders arrived, calling for the regiment to push forward. It was madness, yet in war, madness often masquerades as necessity. Maurice led from the front. He was not the kind of officer to send others where he would not go himself. His men followed, weary but willing, their trust in him stronger than their fear. They crossed stretches of churned earth that had once been farmland, now cratered and scorched. Fences lay twisted, cottages splintered, trees blackened into skeletal spires. It was as though nature itself had been drafted into the conflict and mutilated alongside the men. Then it came, a sudden roar, louder than the rest. A German shell, its arc unseen, fell into their midst. There was no warning, no chance for cover. The explosion tore through the earth with brutal finality, a single instant that erased the boundary between life and death. In the chaos of war, death was often slow, wounds festering, cries echoing through long nights. But for Maurice, it was instantaneous, a curtain falling mid-scene. The blast left little behind. Comrades scrambled in the smoke, ears ringing, soil raining down like dark confetti. They found no body intact, only fragments of what had been a prince, a soldier, a son. His death was as impersonal as the thousands around him, swallowed in the same mud, silenced by the same fire. In that moment, royalty meant nothing. Lineage, titles, ancestry stretching back through centuries, all dissolved in the air, scattered like ash. Maurice's fate was indistinguishable from the countless others who perished that day. In Ypres, death was the great equalizer, indifferent to crowns or poverty. The grandson of Queen Victoria was no more protected than the farmhand from Yorkshire or the miner from Wales. For his men, the loss was felt not as the death of a prince, but as the absence of a leader who had walked beside them. In the stunned silence after the explosion, they carried on because they had no choice. The war did not pause to mourn. Orders still echoed, rifles still cracked, and the front line still demanded bodies to hold it. His death became one more line in the ledger of casualties, recorded with clinical detachment in army reports. News traveled back slowly. Telegrams carried the blunt fact of it. Lieutenant Prince Maurice of Battenberg killed in action, October 27th. No detail, no comfort. For his mother, Beatrice, it was the reopening of an old wound. The loss of her husband to war decades earlier mirrored now in her youngest son. For the royal family, it was a grim reminder that the war they had unleashed upon Europe did not spare even their own. The irony was cruel. Maurice had lived his life as a bridge between Britain and Germany, his very blood a mixture of the two houses. Yet it was German artillery that ended him. Cousin against cousin, dynasty against dynasty. The great family of Europe had fractured, and the shards cut deepest into their own flesh. On the battlefield, The place where he fell was soon unrecognizable. Another shell struck, erasing even the crater left by the first. The earth consumed its secrets, indifferent to the significance of the lives it swallowed. For the men who survived, memory was the only monument. They would recall his calm voice, his steady hand, his refusal to stand apart. That was all that remained when the mud closed over. To die young is tragedy. To die forgotten is annihilation. Maurice's name would not be carved into the triumphal arches of history. He left no heirs, no policies, no legacies of statecraft. Only a date, a place, and the testimony of those who once marched at his side. His death was sudden, but its meaning seeped slowly. The recognition that even princes could be erased in a heartbeat, and that the war devoured lives without discrimination. Thus ended the life of Prince Maurice of Battenberg, not in ceremony, not in the halls of power, but in the faceless anonymity of the Western Front. A grandson of queens, a son of empires, reduced to silence beneath a sky that never wept. The telegram reached England like a blade. October 1914 was already heavy with casualty lists, pages filled with names that blurred into statistics. But one message carried a weight that pierced even the insulated walls of Windsor. Prince Maurice of Battenberg, killed in action, October 27th. The words were stark, unembellished, yet they carried the power to shatter the calm rituals of the royal household. For Princess Beatrice, his mother, grief was no stranger. She had lost her father, Prince Albert, before she was even grown. She had lost her husband Henry to a fever in the African campaign. Now, her youngest son, the last thread of comfort that tied her to a future beyond widowhood, was cut away by shellfire in a foreign field. For a woman who had devoted her entire life to duty, this was not just loss, but a cruel echo of the past. She had given her father her youth, her husband her companionship, and now the war had taken her child. The royal family gathered in solemnity. King George V, himself Maurice's cousin, faced the paradox of mourning both as a monarch and as a man. He had declared war only months earlier. Now, the war had reached into his own bloodline. The symbols of royalty, crowns, scepters, coats of arms, offered no shield from the blunt truth of artillery. For the first time in living memory, a British prince had died in combat, not as a distant casualty of empire, but on European soil, among the common ranks. The newspapers reacted with hushed awe. Headlines spoke of bravery, of sacrifice, of the prince who had chosen to share the fate of his men. Some framed his death as an inspiration, proof that the war united all classes in shared suffering. Yet beneath the patriotic tones, there was a tremor. If even a grandson of Queen Victoria could be reduced to a casualty number, what hope remained for ordinary households scattered across Britain? Indeed, across the nation, the mourning was collective. Families who had buried sons in the mud of Belgium now saw the royal family grieving alongside them. The gulf between palace and cottage narrowed, if only for a moment, by the common language of loss. In Maurice's death, Britain glimpsed a strange kind of democracy. The democracy of grief, where no lineage could buy exemption. Beatrice withdrew into seclusion, her sorrow too deep for public display. Letters from sympathizers poured in, but sympathy could not bridge the chasm. She had raised Maurice with quiet devotion, shielding him from the harsher winds of court intrigue. Now she was left with silence, the silence of rooms where his laughter no longer echoed, the silence of corridors where his footsteps would never return. Ceremonies were held in his honor, yet they felt small compared to the scale of loss at the front. His name was spoken in cathedrals, prayers lifted for his soul, But the truest memorial lay far from England, in the churned fields of Ypres. There, men who had fought beside him carried the memory of a young officer who did not stand apart. They spoke of his calmness under fire, his willingness to share their hardships. To them, he was not Your Highness, but simply Maurice, a man who faced death without retreat. Within the royal household, his absence lingered. At family gatherings, his empty chair became its own kind of monument. His cousins, who would live on to steer their nations through war and upheaval, carried the unspoken knowledge that one of their own had already been consumed. George V, Wilhelm II, Nicholas II. These rulers, bound by blood yet torn by politics, presided over millions of deaths. Maurice, in contrast, had borne the cost personally. His life was the price of decisions made far above his rank. The paradox of his death deepened with time. To the nation, he was a symbol of courage. To his mother, he was a son torn away by fate. To history, he risked becoming just another statistic. Mourning him meant mourning the collapse of illusions. That royalty was untouchable. That lineage guaranteed survival. That war could ever spare the innocent. In the months after his death, Beatrice often spoke of him in whispers, as though saying his name too loudly would wound her further. She carried his photograph close, a reminder not of his rank, but of his youth. The boy who had grown up without a father, who had chosen the hard road of duty, who had vanished into the smoke of Belgium. Royal mourning is often draped in ritual, heavy with trumpets and solemn processions. But Maurice's death carried a different weight. It was not the death of a king on a throne, but of a soldier in mud, of a young man who had not yet reached his prime. The rituals could not disguise that fact. They only highlighted the chasm between the pageantry of grief and the raw, unanswerable silence of loss. For the royal family, the tragedy was personal. For the nation, it was symbolic. For Princess Beatrice, it was unbearable. In losing Maurice, she lost the last echo of a future she had once imagined. The war had reached across borders, across trenches, across time itself, and taken from her the sun she had raised in shadows and hoped to see in light. The battle moved on. As armies surged and retreated, the land around Ypres filled with the anonymous dead. Shells had turned fields into cemeteries before shovels could. For Prince Maurice of Battenberg, there was no return to England, no state funeral beneath the vaulted arches of Westminster. His body, fragmented by artillery, was gathered with care and placed among the thousands who had fallen. The soil of Belgium, wet with rain and gunpowder, became his final cradle. The cemetery chosen was Ypres Town Cemetery, a modest plot near the ruined town. It was not grand, not draped in marble or guarded by statues. Instead, it carried the quiet dignity of rows upon rows of headstones, each one a pale sentinel against forgetting. Here lay farmers and clerks, miners and shopkeepers, young men who had once filled the ordinary rhythms of Britain's streets. And among them, without separation, rested a prince. The headstone that marked his grave was simple. Name, rank, regiment, date. No gilded crest, no ornate epitaph. Just the language of the military dead, uniform in its restraint. To stand before it was to confront the stark equality of war. Royal blood and common blood seeped into the same soil, indistinguishable in the end. The great hierarchy of Europe collapsed into silence beneath the grass. For Beatrice, the reality was unbearable. She longed to bring her son home, to lay him in a place where she could visit him, surrounded by family. But the war made such wishes impossible. To move a body across seas while men were still dying by the thousands each week would have been a privilege too visible. too dangerous. Instead, she was forced to accept that her son's bones would rest in foreign ground, exiled even in death. Visitors to Ypres in the years after the war often wrote of the overwhelming stillness of those cemeteries. The wind that swept across Flanders carried with it the whispers of countless lives extinguished too soon. Among them, Maurice's grave became a quiet testament. A prince who had chosen to stand shoulder to shoulder with his men, and who, like them, never returned. Schoolboys visiting in the 1920s would sometimes pause at his name, surprised that a grandson of Queen Victoria lay in the same soil as privates and corporals. The shock itself became part of the lesson, that war recognized no hierarchy except sacrifice. The grave also bore witness to the erasure of empire's illusions. Britain had once claimed dominion over distant lands, planting cemeteries like outposts in Africa, Asia, and beyond. Now, in Belgium's flat fields, the empire planted its own sons. Each stone was not just a memorial, but an indictment, a reminder of the cost exacted by decisions made far from the trenches. Maurice's name was carved into stone, but it was also carved into the consciousness of a generation that had seen princes and paupers fall together. For those who fought beside him, the grave was more than a marker. It was a promise that his sacrifice would not be forgotten, that his willingness to share their fate would endure beyond the war's chaos. Some veterans would later speak of him with quiet respect, not for his title, but for his humanity. He had walked the same paths, eaten the same rations, faced the same fear. His grave among theirs was the final confirmation that he had never asked to be set apart. Yet time is merciless. As the war dragged on and new battles filled the casualty lists, Maurice's name slipped further into the background. For the Battenberg family, who would soon be forced to abandon their Germanic surname, his grave in Belgium became not just a site of mourning, but a symbol of loss layered upon loss. Even his lineage, once celebrated as a bridge between nations, would be dissolved by the tides of politics. And so, the grave at Ypres became both anchor and exile. It tied Maurice forever to the place of his death, binding him to the story of millions of others who never returned home. At the same time, it separated him from the family who had raised him in the green hills of Britain, leaving them only with photographs and memories. To visit him was to undertake a pilgrimage, crossing seas and battle-scarred lands, to stand before a simple stone that whispered the futility of crowns. In Belgium, the seasons changed as they always had. Spring flowers pushed through the soil where artillery had once struck. Winter frosts traced delicate patterns over the headstones. The grave did not move, but the world moved past it. For Maurice, eternity became a plot of foreign ground, a quiet corner where history paused long enough to remember that even princes could die as soldiers, nameless in the great machinery of war. Prince Maurice's death did not vanish into silence. It rippled outward, shaping both memory and identity. Within a few short years, the Battenberg name itself, a title tied to centuries of German nobility, became unbearable in Britain. As the war ground on and anti-German sentiment hardened, anything that smelled of foreign ancestry was seen as betrayal. Shopkeepers with German surnames had their windows smashed. Even dachshunds were beaten in the streets. For a royal family with Battenberg etched into its lineage, survival meant erasure. In 1917, King George V issued a decree. The family would no longer be Battenberg. They would become Mountbatten, an anglicized echo of the same name, scrubbed of its German edge. It was as if history itself demanded that Maurice's roots be cut from the record. He had died in service to Britain, Yet the heritage he embodied became politically inconvenient, buried alongside him in the mud of Flanders. The transformation was more than cosmetic. Names carry memory, and memory carries power. To change the name was to attempt to sever the past, to obscure the tangled kinship that had once linked Europe's royal houses. The irony was sharp. Maurice had been both British and German, a bridge between two nations. His death in a storm of German artillery highlighted that fracture, and soon the Battenberg identity dissolved into the fog of wartime shame. Even in commemoration, Maurice was marginalized. Unlike kings who fall in battle, his sacrifice did not anchor national myth. He was remembered, yes, but quietly, a footnote in the story of a war that devoured millions. The cemeteries of Flanders stretched endlessly, their uniform stones flattening distinctions. In such company, even princes became anonymous. Yet the aftermath revealed something deeper: the fragility of dynasties themselves. The war that had killed Maurice also toppled thrones. Within 4 years, Wilhelm II fled Germany. Nicholas II was executed with his family, and Austria-Hungary splintered into pieces. Monarchies that had once seemed eternal fell like brittle glass. Maurice's fate, sudden and brutal, was an omen. No crown was secure. No name was immune to the grinding gears of history. For Britain, his death carried another weight. It was a reminder that the war was not fought by others, but by every class, every family, even the royal house itself. When ordinary Britons visited his grave in Belgium, they saw in his headstone the same stark inscription as those of their own sons. In that sameness lay a terrible truth. The Great War had dissolved barriers, if only in death. Maurice of Battenberg became, in the end, both presence and absence. Present in the rows of the fallen, absent in the family name that no longer carried his blood. His life, brief and extinguished in mud, stood as a symbol of a world collapsing in on itself, where nations devoured their own heirs, and history erased even the names carved in stone. History often remembers the victorious generals, the crowned heads who signed treaties, the politicians whose speeches echoed in parliaments. Prince Maurice of Battenberg left none of these behind. He had no heirs, no policies, no monuments raised in his name. What he left instead was silence. And within that silence, a question that still lingers. What is the worth of birthright, if even princes fall to shrapnel like any soldier in the mud? Maurice's legacy lies not in grandeur, but in humility. He did not choose the safer paths his title could have offered. He did not spend the war behind desks or in ceremonial uniforms far from danger. He chose the trenches, the filth, the unrelenting terror of the Western Front. In doing so, he became something more enduring than royalty. He became human to those who fought with him. His comrades remembered him not as a distant aristocrat, but as an officer who carried the same burdens, who walked through the same mud, who died as they did, without privilege, without protection. His grave in Ypres stands today as part of a vast mosaic of loss. Visitors wander among thousands of identical stones, and when they pause at his, the realization strikes. Here lies a grandson of Queen Victoria, indistinguishable from all the others. In that anonymity, there is a strange kind of democracy. War stripped away the illusions of hierarchy and revealed a truth that endures. Death does not respect crowns. The Battenberg name was erased, the family absorbed into the Mountbattens. But Maurice's story continues to echo quietly. It is a reminder that history's violence spares no one, that even those born in palaces are not immune to the randomness of artillery. His brief life forces us to reconsider the myths of invulnerability that surround power. What good are thrones if they cannot shield their heirs from the thunder of cannons? Perhaps his truest legacy is the empathy his story inspires. For once, the distance between rulers and ruled narrowed, not through politics, but through grief. Mothers who lost sons at Ypres could look at Princess Beatrice and see their sorrow reflected. Soldiers who survived could speak of a prince who had not hidden behind rank. In death, Maurice became what monarchs rarely achieve in life, a symbol of shared humanity. Time has blurred his name, tucked it into the footnotes of war. But for those who stop before his stone in Belgium, or who read of his fate in forgotten histories, he remains more than a casualty. He is the embodiment of a truth Europe learned too late, that no bloodline, however noble, can escape the hunger of war. Prince Maurice of Battenberg did not leave behind empires or dynasties. He left behind a grave among soldiers, a silence among royals, and a question that echoes like distant shellfire. When the cannons roar, who is truly safe?